whether you believe in gravity or not. If you drop an apple, it will fall down and not up. It's the same with the economy. I mean, if you cut government spending, you cut income for the non-government sector. That's an economic law in that sense. There's nothing you can do about it. Some people believe in fairy tales and they don't have these scientific foundations, these empirical foundations.
It's not past him to understand these basics, that the government cannot go broke. But when it's politically useful, they'll adopt the opposite narrative. And they are actively trying to dumb us down because it fits their agenda.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. Just jumping in here to tell you that Modern Money Lab UK are running 2 weekend workshops in London in June 2025. The first weekend is in White City on the weekend of the 21st and 22nd of June, and that will be a UK version of Dr. Stephen Hale and Gabrielle Bond's highly successful Rethinking Capitalism workshops, facilitated by Stephen in person. It's a 2-day seminar focused on solving the most urgent issues facing the world today, including economic inequality and insecurity and, of course, climate change. And the course will lay out how to build a fair and sustainable economy within planetary boundaries using the modern monetary theory lens and ecological economics. The second weekend takes place near Finsbury Park on the weekend of the 28th and 29th of June. That seminar is entitled Money, Government and the Public Interest, Beyond the Deficit Myth. And that will consist of a series of introductory talks and facilitated group discussions with Stephen based on short articles and case studies relating to the nature of money and the role of the national budget. The second event is aimed at empowering people to counter the narrative that vital public investment in healthcare, in education, in climate action is unaffordable or must be paid for via unnecessary and destructive austerity measures. I'll link to Modern Money Lab UK in the show notes for this episode. Details and ticket links are not yet available at the time of recording, but when they are published, that'll be the place to look. You can just search Modern Money Lab UK or go to modernmoneylab.org.uk. I'll also link to some other things you might find helpful for following the conversation in this particular episode. Finally, as ever, I'll link to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at £1 a month or $1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live, and supporting the show in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as always for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT Podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we're delighted to be joined once again today by our friend, economist, author and parliamentary assistant at the European Parliament in Brussels, Dr. Dirk Ehnts. Hi, Dirk.
Hi, Christian. Hi, Patricia.
So in this episode, we're going to be correcting some misinformation about the money system that sprung from the mind of Elon Musk in recent times. But to set the table first, I want to start with something from your recent book, Dirk, which is called MMT, A Simple Guide to the Monetary System, where you write, money has never been neutral. What do we mean by that?
Well, in the mainstream conception of economics, money is supposed to be neutral in the sense that it does not influence the real economy. So they basically say, well, when you increase the monetary supply, all that happens is that you get an increase in the rate of inflation. So if you double the money supply, then you will have double the amount of inflation, but there will be no other changes. And that's not true. Because we know that, for example, bank loans finance investment, also government finances public investment. And if there's more investment, there's going to be higher productivity, there's going to be different or new products, and there will be maybe more employment. So we know very well that if you change the amount of spending in the economy, and then that has something to do with the amount of bank deposits created, obviously, but it's about the spending and the income thing rather, then this, of course, has an effect on the real economy.
And, Patricia, I know, you did a master's in neoclassical or mainstream economics. And the idea behind it, that money is neutral is really just saying, really what we've got is a barter economy, and money is just there as a sort of neutral lubricant, making the barter happen in a more efficient way. Is that, how it was taught to you?
Yeah, I think to be honest, it has to do a lot with the way that the neoclassicals deal with the subject of value and the value of money per se. It allows them to say that money is neutral. It allows them to just simply sideline that question. As Dirk says, is never has been neutral. Money is a tool that our most powerful entity within the economy uses to mobilize resources. So it's definitely not neutral. What the classics, including Marx, would say was that capitalism moves according to the kind of the sequence money, commodity, money. And so money plays a key role in connecting through time the exchange of commodities.
Yeah, and the reason we like to talk about this, the nature and origins of money, is because the nature and origins of money are very important to politics, and that's really what's going to come out as this conversation unfolds. So at various times in the last few weeks and months, a very prominent figure, Elon Musk, has said America is going bankrupt. Dirk, is that true? Can that even happen?
No, that's not true, and it cannot be true. I mean, the monopoly of the creation of the US dollar is definitely with the Federal Reserve Bank system. So they are the only ones who can create US dollars in accounts at the central bank over there. And they cannot run out of US dollars because they just tied them into existence. So every time the US government spends money, they basically create money for that, or when the government sells a bond to the private markets, then they get also an increase in the amount of their Treasury General account, so of their balance. So there's never a problem of the Fed somehow not having enough money. And if you look at the both the quantity and also the percentage numbers. So if you look at the trillions of US dollar, I think by now they are way above 30 trillion US dollar in terms of so-called public debt. And I mean, there were people saying that the public debt of the United States would collapse and there was 10 trillion. And then they said it again when it was 20 trillion, and then again now. And it's very obvious that there's nothing wrong with the government having a so-called public debt that goes into the trillions. I mean, it's just a statistical number. The public debt is just the amount of US dollars that the federal government spent, minus what they took back in terms of tax revenues, and everything that is outstanding has been swapped by the central bank for treasury bonds. And that makes up the so-called public debt. But it's nothing that somehow the US government would have to repay, or somehow that would provide them with more money. So what Elon Musk says there is completely without any kind of scientific basis.
So I should just say we're looking at Elon Musk because instead of running for office, what he's done is he's bought his way into the US government. And at the time of recording this, he's in the process of finding ways to dismantle parts of the government that he doesn't like, including parts of the government that would eventually be regulating some of his business activities. There's some talk about him effectively starting a bank really through X. So he's trying to dismantle parts of the government via a non-government organization called Doge, which the media are misleadingly depicting as a non-ideological institution, just trying to find efficiencies, even as it tries to stop the government spending on things that Musk and Trump don't agree with. And that's funding that's already been appropriated. So there's already a vetting process for government spending. The spending has to be approved by Congress. So Doge has come in after that as an ideological project aimed at dismantling government departments. Now, what I think we can add is an emphasis on this point that all government budgets are moral documents. In other words, because currency issuing governments create new money as they spend, as you just said, Dirk, they can't run out of money. And so the reasons for a government funding one thing and not funding another are always ideological. The budget is an expression of the collective values of the government that passes it. And some spending that Musk doesn't like has been passed, and now he's using this economic fallacy that the government can run out of money to justify dismantling parts of the government that he and Trump oppose on ideological grounds.
I completely agree with you, Christian, that spending decisions by the government are inherently ideological. I do think within that, though, there is room for talking about efficiency. For example, and I would frame it like this. I would say, okay, the government is spending X much in order to achieve Y. Is there something else, another way of spending that would mean that we're using less resources and also still achieving Y, still achieving that main objective? So I think we can talk in efficiency in those terms. The issue with me,
but he's not doing that.
No, he's not doing that. Elon Musk is treating government like if it was a business.
No, but I don't even think he's doing that. He's not going, oh, this is inefficient and we can do this in a better way. That's why I'm going in there and dismantling this department because I just love efficiency so much. That's not why he's stopping funds going to certain places. It's ideological.
Yes, he's defunding things that he disagrees with, like what you're saying, because he doesn't even believe in the aims of that spending. But he's framing his narrative, his justification for it is the belief that if I'm good at running a business, then running a government is no different. And all I have to do is just, gut departments and make people work longer or have more inhumane conditions or just whatever these capitalists do. And I'll get the good outcomes, which in his view is reducing the deficit and, increasing government revenues, which are to him are akin to business profit.
Yeah. And so, just to go on like what his public statements have been, in December, Musk tweeted, if action is not taken to curb the deficit, America is in deep trouble. And then he goes on to say, it's no different than a person who gets into too much debt. Now, Dirk, is that true? That a country led by a government which issues its own floating exchange rate currency, when that government runs a deficit, like when it spends more than it collects, is that the same as a private sector individual going into debt?
No, obviously not. So the government, via its central bank, is the creator of currency. And that is completely different from us. We are users of currency. So when I owe my bank 10,000 euros, let's say, then I would have to repay that. And I would have to think about how to get those 10,000 euros to repay my loan. Whereas if I'm the US government, I can just spend. And if I need to repay a loan, in that case, a bond, I just credit the account of the bondholder, and that's about it. So I can always use money creation to make payments. In fact, there's nothing else. But me as a private person, also firms and companies, they do have to worry about where they get the money from that they need to repay their debt and also to pay the interest before they pay back the principal. So yeah, the idea that you can run a government like a household, that of course is something which also in the Eurozone has existed for at least 10 or 20 years, but nobody took it as far as they now do in the United States, I would say.
I saw this other tweet of his, his take on government debt seems to be like born out of the fear that, someone's going to come after him to pay off the national debt. So, he's written like, even if you tax every billionaire in America at 100%, it barely makes a dent in the national debt. In the end, the government will have to. So he's like, come on, don't come after me. And then he goes, in the end, the government will have to be, in the end, this is how he says it. In the end, the government will be forced to tax everyone to pay the debt. I mean, is that right? Well,
what he's saying is, you and I are the same. We're in the same boat.
Yeah.
No, we're not. We are not.
Actually, he's on a super yacht, and that's the big difference. So you can't tax us because we have almost no income compared to his, and we have almost no wealth. So it's kind of obvious that he has to somehow find a solution for this problem, that you can get rid of public debt if you wanted to by raising taxes. And that is, of course, why he needs to somehow metaphorically speak in a way that you and I, or we and him, are in the same boat, so that he pretends that he's not on a super yacht, and that this is not a solution, this idea of increasing taxes, because obviously it would be a solution if you would be serious about bringing down the public debt.
But that his assertion that the government, like he says, in the end, there's nothing for it. The government will be forced to tax everyone to pay the debt. And I think there's two parts to that. The one part is in the end.
At the end of the world?
Yeah, exactly. The end of America, the debt is going to become due. It's like...
They do think that, though. They do think that by the end of... I've seen that assumption in a couple of places in mainstream economics, that by the end of the world, you have to pay all of the debt.
Sometimes I ask my students whether the Roman Empire had repaid its debt. And then they're kind of thinking, what does he mean? And of course, every time the Roman government, like 2,000 years ago, spent a gold coin, that of course increased the public debt. And every time they collected a gold coin through taxation, they decreased the public debt. So whenever gold coins are found, Roman gold coins are found somewhere in Europe, they are uncovered because they were somehow maybe hidden there by somebody 2,000 years ago.
Probably hidden there by the Elon Musk of their day.
Yeah. Well, whenever you find a gold coin from Roman times, you can say, okay, so the Romans did not repay their public debt. That's what it means when you find a Roman coin outside of the Roman treasury.
Absolutely, yeah. So the 4-minute warning comes along. And, it's the end of the world. We're 4 minutes to the end of the world. Everyone's like, oh, my God, you know what we forgot to do? Everybody, get your checkbook out now.
Only 4 minutes left.
How do we address that in a serious way, that this idea that the government will be forced to tax everyone to pay off the national debt?
Yeah, I mean, if we explain to people how government spending works, that it's actually just the central bank, which is crediting an account of a bank, and then the bank credits the account of the person or the firm receiving the money, or might be a government institution even. So every time that the government spends, its money creation, and then tax revenues means that the money comes back, and then you just delete the money that you had created when you spent. So if you think about government spending as an Excel sheet, just lots of columns and rows, and then you have accounts and the balances go up and down, then of course you are in a world where you will never run out of money, because it's just like a scoreboard. If we think about the monetary system as a scoreboard, then just like at a basketball game, for example, you should not worry when the basketball score goes beyond 100, for example, for a single team. It's nothing to be afraid of. I mean, they will not end the game because they run out of points. And that's the same with the monetary system. Of course, creating money, and that's how you start this, is it's not neutral. Of course, if you give money to people, that will have effects on the economy, especially if you're talking about billions and trillions of dollars or pounds or euros. That might have an effect on inflation, on wages, on distribution, on, energy consumption or raw material extraction. So we're never saying that somehow government spending, the effect it has on its public deficit and the public debt, of course, that can have an economic effect, but by itself, it's just a statistic. So the public debt to GDP ratio, or just the public debt itself, it's just a number, and there's no way for the government to control it. So it's just an outcome. It's not that somehow households are, reducing their consumption because they see that government spending is higher, or they see that public debt is higher. So almost nobody in the economy knows about these numbers. So I think it's pretty safe to say that the direct effects of high public debt, or high public debt to GDP ratio, let's say more than 90%, but high, of course, it's not really high. It's high compared to the others. Then that will have some kind of effect, but it's really close to zero.
Now, sometimes when people quote the national debt figure, it's just a statistic, as you just said, Dirk. But sometimes they mean the value of all outstanding government bonds. Is it the case that those two figures won't be the same to the penny? The government issues bonds to match their anticipated spending in excess of taxation. And it's important to say match their spending and not fund their spending. So they issue bonds to match anticipated spending in excess of taxation, but they can't get it precisely right to the penny. Is that fair enough to say that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what they are doing is they issue bonds because whenever the government spends, it credits the accounts of the banking system, and the banks then they don't know what to do with that money. So they want to lend it out on the interbank market. And that means that the more you spend, the more pressure there is on the interbank market, because there's going to be lots of banks saying, well, we have lots of reserves, central bank deposits. We don't know what to do with them. So we want to have an interest rate, so we lend them out. So whoever wants to borrow, here's our offer. So if you want to borrow at, 3.5%, we would be willing to give you, £1 million or something. And that means that when the government spends, there's going to be pressure on the interest rate in the interbank market. And the bond selling is just there, or historically it has just been there to stabilize the interest rate. In modern times, so speaking about the last 10 plus years in the United States and talking about the last 25 years in the Eurozone, if you pay interest on deposits at the central bank, a deposit rate is positive, then of course you can stabilize the interbank market rate by just that. So banks that collect 3% on the deposits at the central bank will not lend out that money, those reserves, for 2.5% or 1%. But in the good old times, that did happen. So they probably were using bonds to stabilize the interbank market interest rate. And that, of course, meant that whatever the banks wanted to get rid of in terms of reserves, that would have to be absorbed by bond sales, but not more. Everybody knows in economics that there's open market operations, that central banks are trying to influence liquidity by buying and selling government bonds. And that means that from the very start of central banking, bonds had been held at the central bank, if only for the purposes of open market operations. So that meant that if you think that the public debt has to be equal to the amount of public bonds in the hands of the people or the non-government sector, then that has never been true. And there's also complications. Many countries, for example, historically speaking, many countries had central bank bonds, for example. I think Singapore has them even today. So if you count central bank bonds also as public sector bonds, which they are, then of course you could have a number or quantity of public bonds outstanding that is even higher than the public debt. Especially since I think that Singapore, if they have public debt, I think they might not have any public debt. Then of course it can be the case that the number of outstanding bonds is even higher than the public debt.
There was a big story January this year, and it was that UK gilt yields reached a 16-year high, and that got translated in the news, as it always does, to government borrowing costs are at a 16-year high. Now, my first response to that is to say, first of all, borrowing is not borrowing when you create money. So yes, you can take money off somebody and say, I'm holding that, I'm borrowing it off you. But I would say borrowing is not borrowing when you create money. So it's very misleading characterization of government bond issuance to call it borrowing. Would you agree with that, Dirk? And, either way, to somebody relatively new to this, how would you better characterize what the government is doing when it issues gilts?
There was this movie, or there is this documentary, Finding the Money, by Maren Poitras, which is excellent. And she interviews Jared Bernstein from the Council of Economic Advisors of Joe Biden. She asks him, so how does the government of the United States spend money? And he says, well, we print money and we borrow money. And then he kind of stops because it doesn't make a lot of sense. So yeah, if we can print money, why do we borrow money? So he just repeats. So yeah, we print money and then we borrow money. And then he wanted to say something more to explain why that is, because if you can print money, why would you want to borrow money? I mean, printing money obviously costs almost nothing. So borrowing money seems to cost an interest rate. Yeah, I mean, that's why we have to think of bond issuance as an operation that stabilizes the interest rate. It's not a financing operation at all. So you can see it also in the roots of those words like tax revenues and bond revenues. Revenues comes from French revenu, to come back. So the government spends and then the money comes back to it in the form of bond revenues. So the non-government sector is purchasing government bonds, and that's how the money is gone. Because when it goes back to the state, then of course it has no more value. So normally what we call money is actually tax credits. And if the tax credit returns to the issuer, then of course the government doesn't pay taxes. So that in the hands of the government, that tax credit is basically just a piece of paper. And of course, these pieces of paper can also be returning to the state when people pay their taxes, so through tax revenues.
Yeah, I think this is important to call out, because in response to those gilt yields going up, the government then act as if they are borrowing and that they won't be able to afford the repayments on these so-called loans that they've taken out. So they'll have to cut back on their spending. And the week this story came out, Keir Starmer and the Treasury officials then ordered the cabinet minister to pursue, in their words, ruthless cuts. They use the word ruthless. Now, you know, if they do cut spending based on a movement in gilt yields and nothing else, those cuts will be completely unnecessary.
Yeah. I mean, that's not the way to run a monetary system, but this is the price that Labour now pays, because they had two options a couple of years ago. They could play the pay-for game and stay within the mainstream economics consensus, saying that the government has to borrow money before they spend. So first you have either to have bond revenues or tax revenues and then you spend, which is not true, but it was probably easier for some people in Labour to score points with the city, for example, of London. And the other would be to say, well, look, we have a sovereign currency, and as long as we have idle resources, we can just increase government spending, and then the non-government's income goes up. They will consume more. But if there's enough resources and enough goods that they can purchase without prices increasing, then we're good to go. So we should budget for price stability and full employment, and not budget for having a small fiscal surplus or having a lower deficit or something like that. So there's only two ways to do things: budgeting for full employment and price stability, or budgeting for austerity, basically. And it's not a surprise. I mean, all the governments of the left that in the last 20 years have gone that way, basically talking about fiscal sustainability all the time, talking about bond yields and how rising bond yields would cause them to basically reduce the government spending. They've all ended in the same place. I mean, they've all been kicked out of their office because they imposed austerity on their electorate. And of course, government spending leads one-to-one to an increase in income for the non-government sector. So if you cut government spending, you're also cutting the income of households, and you're cutting also the profits of firms. So whatever you think you're doing, it's not going to be working, because you will ruin the economy and people will probably not vote for you again.
I completely agree that that's what the left has seemed, well, left in inverted commas are kind of liberal parties, center parties, which are really a little bit to the right, to be fair.
We can't even say centre-left anymore, can we?
No, we can't. They're very kind of business-focused city. You know, their main priority is to please the City of London, and they've adopted the whole economic kind of ideas of the right. And you can't do anything remotely left-wing with that. But they think that if they play along, they'll make a little bit of space for maybe something not as terrible as what the Conservatives do, and they always fail.
There's this book by Clara Mattei from University of Tulsa, who, by the way, opened the Center for Heterodox Economics last week, which was very nice to see something fresh happening going on. And yeah, she wrote that book, and she said that it's a political thing. So those people who are in the industrial sector and in the banking sector, that they want to ensure that the government is not powerful enough to have their own ideas, and they limit the power of the government by imposing these austerity policies. So it's a political strategy that they are using, and of course they know that they are doing something which is not necessary, but it's good for them. It keeps them in power, and that's why they do it. Even though 99% of the people are losing from these kind of policies, and I mean these policies have instabilized the whole European continent plus the United Kingdom over the last 20 years. And I'm not sure how much more the European people can take. I think that inequality is really high by now in most countries, and also still rising, or even rising faster now. I've seen a couple of Bernie Sanders videos lately, and it's the same in the United States. The wealth of Bezos and Musk and Zuckerberg, I think they have increased their wealth by more than $10 billion each. since the election of Donald Trump, for example. Most Americans didn't see an increase of their wage by, probably not by a single cent inside a month. So this is a very unstable social and political situation that we are facing.
This is what annoys me the most, is that I'm pretty sure Trump understands these things are not true. And by extension, I am pretty sure, and Musk is not, at times he's not fully competent, but he's not, it's not past him to understand these basics. And given that he spent so much time with Trump, you would expect him to know that the government cannot go broke, that the debt is simply not a problem.
Trump has said more than a few times, I think, we can't, we can't run out of money. We print the money,
Yeah. But when it's politically useful, they'll adopt the opposite narrative. And this is what annoys me the most, that they are actively trying to dumb us down into this narrative because it fits their agenda. I find that unforgivable. And I know they're not the only people or the first people to have done that. We've dealt with various degrees of that over the past couple of decades. But they're doing it at a point where we're getting, as you say, inequality is getting just unbearable. If it was bad in 2008, right? But it's been, from then on, we haven't changed course. So it's just gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. The pandemic made things even worse. And every single solution that they present as the whole political class presenters, is always geared towards more inequality.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up the 2017 tax cuts by Trump, which ballooned the deficit to $1 trillion. And nobody cared about the deficit then.
Exactly. They don't care. But they care when it's about actually having the government do anything useful for people. They see, as you say, it's a tool to make way for capital to take over key industries and take over anything that matters to anybody, right? And by preventing the government from, pretending that the government is unable to do something so that it doesn't do it. And therefore, you can hand it over to the people that can make a profit while doing it. I just find it so cynical and horrible at this point. And I think we're at breaking point.
Just going back to that story about gilt yields spiking in January, part of the news story that I read, an anonymous MP said, and by anonymous we can presume this is actually Rachel Reeves and the government's party line, but they just don't have the courage to personally deliver it. This anonymous source said that a change to the fiscal rules wasn't possible because they said the last thing you want is for a chancellor to be changing her fiscal rules 6 months into a government. That doesn't inspire any confidence.
What?
Right. So that's what they fall back on, they go, so the only thing logically that can be said at the moment is we will have to tighten our belt.
Oh no, we have to kill a few people because the worst thing that can happen is she changes the rule. God forbid. I get the feeling they still think we're in the 1990s and everybody's still kind of out there shopping with their credit card and not really caring about politics. But if you see what's happening here and how frighteningly, parties like Reform are gaining ground, you can tell this is not like the 90s at all.
So, let's address this scare story where they try to scare the population. It happens all over the world in the economies like ours. They try and scare people about the amount of debt that the government is in and it won't be able to afford its interest payments and all this kind of stuff. So I wanted to address it by just picking through a news item about a recent UK bond auction. So the headline was, UK sells £1 billion of bonds on the most expensive terms since 2004. And then it goes on to say the bond sale attracted solid demand, but it was on the most expensive terms since 2004. And that these bonds being so cheap underscores the cost to taxpayers from a recent sell-off in bond markets. First of all, did that bond sell-off cost taxpayers anything?
No, these two things are not connected. Whenever the government is making a payment, it doesn't matter whether it's a payment for, a bag of apples to a farmer, or whether it's a payment for interest on a government bond, on a gilt. It's always money creation by the Bank of England. So the scandal here is, of course, that these people are buying government bonds and there's a positive interest rate, then they get something for nothing. because having money is not something which we should reward as a society. I mean, you're just sitting there doing nothing. In that sense, it's unearned income. And the question is, why is the interest rate not zero? And that's a policy question, because the Bank of England could always reduce interest rates to zero if they wanted to. So the whole issue of having yields going up and bond prices going down and whatnot, it all boils down to the Bank of England determining the interest rate. And if we look at Japan, for example, the Bank of Japan, they set the interest rate at basically at zero for the last almost 15 years. I think they've been increasing it just a little bit now, but it's still very close to zero. So if you think that people should not get additional money for not consuming today, because that would be constituting unearned income, then you can just stop that by setting interest rates at zero at the central bank. And it doesn't matter how much public debt you have. I mean, after a couple of years these government bonds have a maturity normally of no more than 30 years. Exceptions, of course, exist. But after 30 years, in Japan, we have 15 years almost of zero interest rates. So that means that there are very little bonds outstanding that carry high interest rates. And if you have another 15 years of zero interest rates in Japan, then almost nothing could be earned by buying government bonds from Japan. So that's how this whole thing should be framed. Yeah, it's a decision of the central bank, and it affects the distribution. And it affects also the distribution in the sense that if there's people who have debt contracts, like, mortgages or loans, which have a flexible interest rate, then of course interest rates rising would also mean that these borrowers would be worse off because they would have to have higher interest rate payments.
They like pointing out that the interest payments are so high, right? Here and in the US, they like doing that, but they never question the interest rate. They always go for, well, the only way to lower that is to get rid of the debt altogether, and that means to lower government spending.
Yeah, these are typical neoclassical economists. For them, the price is always determined by the market, and the market is supply and demand. So if you want to reduce the price, you have to reduce supply. The demand is given by the market. That's their logic. But of course, it doesn't work in modern financial markets, and it hasn't been working for 100 years. This kind of logic, because interest rates are set by the central bank, and the yields can only diverge from the central bank's interest rates because the central bank lets them diverge. It's also a policy decision not to set long-term interest rates. They could always do that. That's why the mainstream economists have been having so much trouble with interpreting the financial crisis and also the fiscal situation, because their whole worldview of prices determined on markets is completely wrong when it comes to this kind of issue.
Next thing I wanted to move on to is what that sell-off that they were talking about that made yields go up. That's in the secondary market, right? And that sell-off. These bonds were being traded in the secondary market. Sellers wanted a different form of money than the bonds they had. The buyers wanted the bonds more than the form of money that they were holding. There was an exchange at a price. What's the problem?
There's no problem at all. If that's the way things are working, if the Treasury would issue new government bonds and yields have gone up in the meantime, they would have to offer higher yields. But since they cannot run out of money anyway, there's no problem with that. Also, the United Kingdom is not part of the European Union anymore, obviously, so the Stability and Growth Pact doesn't apply. Apart from the considerations of having more unearned income for rich people, there's really nothing wrong with that. Well, apart from the fact, of course, that you could say that it's not nice to have these high interest rates when it comes to long-term investment. It adds to the price of long-term investment, which is a problem maybe when it comes also to public investment and private investment. But there's nothing wrong with the government. The government should not then say, let's cut government spending because we would have to make more bond payments in the future. That would be the completely wrong reaction.
Also, those high yields, low prices in the secondary market for bonds, if they were causing turmoil or they're unhealthy, like you were just describing, Dirk, if we decided, look, that's not a great investment climate, or the Bank of England didn't like the prices for whatever reason, they could just get the price wherever they wanted with a bond buying program, just like they did after the Liz Truss fiasco, right?
But that's printing money. And don't you know Japan is going to collapse any day because of it? Don't you know that?
Okay, just in case you didn't put enough sarcasm into your voice there, Patricia, this is what the government does when markets become disorderly. So the next line of the story is that the Debt Management Office, DMO, sold £1 billion of inflation-linked gilts. Due in 2054, they received bids worth 3.06 times that sum. First of all, why would the DMO, which is part of the Treasury, I'm sorry for not knowing this. I'm sure there's a really simple answer. But, why would they have to issue and auction these bonds? We're told that the BOE has a ton of bonds that they've acquired over the years due to QE and buying bonds to control bond yields, such as after the Liz Truss fiasco. Why couldn't those bonds be sold back into the market instead and achieve the same thing?
Yeah, I don't know why they do it. I mean, probably there is demand for inflation index bonds. Then the Bank of England, they normally talk about offering financial assets that are demanded by the market, and that would be why they are selling those now. They also probably talk about smoothening the yield curve, these kind of things. They kind of invent all kind of excuses to offer insurance. These inflation index bonds are of course nice to have for those who buy them because they're protected against inflation. In other countries, if you want to be protected against inflation, you would have to buy real estate, and then you have somebody paying the rent, and the rent is adjusted with an inflation index as well. But in some countries, this is not allowed. So there's always a search for yield and also a search for certain risk and yield combinations. And I think that's probably what's going on in the United Kingdom also, that some investors are scared that somehow fiat currencies will somehow explode or the dollar will get stronger. And then this will mean that you will have more inflation in the United Kingdom, all these kind of crazy ideas, but they feed through into this kind of policy area. And then you have all this demand for inflation index bonds. And I think that's what's driving that.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in. One of the lines in this news item, it says, investors are watching to see how businesses are responding to a sharp increase in payroll taxes imposed in UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves' autumn budget. Many, such as retailers, have said that they will be forced to raise their prices and may have to cut jobs. So there's a fair bit to go on here. First of all, was the tax hike necessary for the purposes of revenue?
Yeah, absolutely not.
No.
Obviously, the next question through our lens, obviously taxes for revenue are obsolete. So the next question is, well, was the tax hike necessary to limit aggregate demand for whatever reason?
Yeah, that is also the old mainstream thinking that I think now has been thrown out of the window with the last couple of years. So, yeah, I mean, this idea that you can have too much demand and then there's just too much money and not enough goods. Theoretically, it's possible. And I believe that probably in the 1950s during the Korea War, maybe there was something like that going on, but we haven't seen it for another 70 years. So that is why this is more of a theoretical problem. It's a bit like hyperinflation. So yes, it's possible and it would be nasty, but it's like warning somebody not to walk outside in the streets because that person might be hit by lightning, which is also true, but the probability of being hit by lightning is extremely small. So that's not a reason to go out to the streets.
Then the next question about taxes, would that tax hike cause income to be more equitably distributed? I don't think so. I don't know. I just think it's gonna hit the low end of the income distribution the hardest.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. One of you haven't asked this question, but the one that interests me the most is impact on inflation. If we think about cost push inflation and the fact that labor is a cost into everything we make, into all industries, that increasing the cost of labor by increasing national insurance contributions then therefore has a high potential of causing an inflationary pressures. And of course, the only way to go around that, maybe you could say, oh, well, employers could absorb the increasing cost of labor by reducing their own profits. And in some cases, that may be, the right thing to expect from big employers and things like that. But the question here is small business owners who haven't had a great time in recent years because of the lack of investment and austerity has hit aggregate demand as well for them. And that has affected their business. So they're already not doing great. And then you add this price on top of it, then you force them to do certain things. They either have to reduce the amount of employees that they have, and in some cases that may be okay. In some cases that may not be right. Okay, for example, in hairdressers and things like that, things that are quite labor intensive. And in other cases, they may have to either sack their employees or force them to take a pay cut. And in cases where they're already earning the minimum wage, then they might have to just close shop. And therefore, you could potentially contribute to a downturn and destruction of these businesses. We have to consider that. I understand these businesses are not, like, there are people who have endured worse conditions, obviously, since austerity began. But these businesses are also quite pivotal in kind of supporting the left and being able to benefit from the government investment in the way that workers can. So it's quite important to take care of them, I think. And in this case, we are on the left. Again, I'm doing inverted commas here. Is actively antagonizing them by doing this, and allows somebody from the right or an outsider to claim to be fighting in their interests when we know they're not.
Yeah, it's so predictable, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Just leaving a massive open goal there for, a demagogue to come in and stick it in the back of the net.
If we accept the fact that she thinks she has to reduce, that her fiscal rules are the most important thing in the world and that she has to sort this deficit out, why she decided to go for that particular tax. I mean, I know why she's not taxing the financial sector, right? But but why this particular tax, which seems to have antagonized so many people?
Of course, between economic theory and political practice, there's a huge gap. So I would think that most people who are in politics, they look at very simple talking points, and they also stick a long time to their position, even if they know that it is a losing position. But for them, they are interested in credibility, and they have loyalty also as an issue, and they are part of certain social networks. And then, of course, you get into certain social networks. And I think Rachel Reeves, after the election, she said something that she met somebody from the City of London who did a presentation on the wonders of private investment and how that can be somehow blended in without having to increase public investment, so that you can have the deficit rules or debt rules or the fiscal framework, whatever it is that Labour has wanted to impose, and still have high economic growth and a just economy and an equitable economy. I mean, once you hang out with these people, and she probably didn't meet them in the elevator, and then that happened and she's never seen her again, but probably she's part of a social network and they meet every once in a while. And then you are kind of stuck with this group. I think that's probably why these kind of solutions come out, where you normally would think, but this will destroy the party. Yes, it will destroy the party. It will lead to defeat in the next elections, and it's completely unnecessary. But I mean, that's how reality is. I mean, you have to look at the people in power. And that is also why, of course, when it comes to the elections that if you have somebody like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, they are not bound by these kind of social networks that Rachel Reeves has tapped into, I guess. So if you really want to see some change, you would have to elect a politician who has her or his own ideas and is not part of these kind of social networks and does not need somehow, for example, to make political compromises with people in the press or people in the right-wing media or people in the corporate sector or in the financial sector. That kind of limits the political leeway that you have as chancellor in that case. But that's probably how she got into the position in the first place. So
I also heard the perspective recently that the taxation of that particular tax was aimed at increasing the cost of employment altogether. It was aimed at increasing the cost of labor with the objective. I don't know if she thinks in this way, but the premise is that with the objective of increasing productivity, so that businesses won't be able to rely on cheap labor, and then they may invest in machinery or invest in more efficient systems and things like that. Is that something that you can achieve just by simply a small tax increase?
the problem is that, of course, the costs of business are going up for all the other businesses. So in terms of the relative position of the company, nothing changes. So they're not more competitive and they're not less competitive. So they will not feel a certain urge somehow to cut costs because nothing really has happened. I mean, they will have higher costs with the higher VAT, for example. They'll pass it on to the consumers. Everybody else is doing the same thing. You get an increase in inflation, like a one-time increase, and that will be it. I mean, if you are a businessman, why would you react to that kind of thing?
By spending more money, right? By getting into more debt.
Yeah, and also, I mean, aggregate demand will go down because now there's more taxes or a higher tax to pay. So they will be selling less. So that will mean that
less justification to invest.
Yeah, so you want to make sure that you can pay off your liabilities. So this is completely going into the wrong kind of direction. What you could do, of course, is you could increase the tax rates for the corporations themselves. And that would kind of make it a different calculation. So they say, well, if we pay out dividends, then we will be taxed, 30%. But if we invest the money, we can pump up the share price, which is good for us as the management because we probably have share options. And it's also good for the shareholders because instead of having a dividend, they get a higher share price if it's a good investment. So historically, economists have always said that if you want to increase private investment, you have to increase tax rates and not lower them. Only in the last 30 or so years did economists somehow forget about this argument. But I think it was not that the argument is wrong or somehow there was empirical evidence that said, okay, it's not like that. But I think you just get a different branch of economists today. And they probably have never heard of this argument and the logic, but the logic is still sound. If you want to make companies invest, increase tax rates on them directly, that will mean that paying out dividends does not make sense anymore. So that kind of redirects the cash flow from shareholders to investment inside the company.
Right. So, you have to tax the dividends rather than just corporation tax.
Yeah.
Because obviously, I think Randy co-authored a paper, I think, with Dimitri about corporation tax tends to get passed through to the consumers at the end of the day. Yeah.
Even there, it's a question of competition there. I mean, if there's not a lot of competition, then that's correct. If there is enough competition, then that would not be happening. So it depends a little bit.
Because we're touching on inflation, we've now got the wonderful opportunity to go back to Elon Musk. So here's his take on inflation, and he's often just flat out saying government overspending causes inflation. That's his jam, for the last couple of years. And then trying to sound a bit more technical about it, last year he tweeted, money supply increasing faster than the production of goods and services causes inflation. So he's, putting on his boffin spectacles there. Is there anything wrong in that statement?
This is the thing, this is a quantity theory of money, right? This is monetarism. This is monetarism. And the main problem with that is that they can never define exactly what they mean by money. What money? Do you mean reserves? Do you mean bank credit? And if you don't mean bank credit, why not? Why is that different? The government doesn't control the money supply if you include bank credit within that.
And you should include bank credit in that, really.
Well, if what you're talking about is aggregate demand, then yes, you should include bank credit in that. But they usually mean reserves, right? Which is what the government controls.
It depends. They have M1, M2, M3, and they're jumping around, and they measure M3 in a different way because it doesn't fit.
Let me just jump in here though, and say, for anyone new here, the quantity theory of money, it's not necessarily that the equation or identity is wrong, the MV equals PY. It's that in order for it to say what the monetarists think it says, you have to assume full employment.
Yeah.
And we're not at full employment. And you also have to assume constant velocity, which is not the case as well.
And you have also to assume that causation only goes one way.
Right.
So you have to assume that an increase in the money supply causes higher prices, whereas it could be the opposite. It could be the case that people react to higher prices by taking out more cash and holding higher liquidity storage. So that would, of course, make perfect sense. What they're really lacking is a theory of how an increase in the monetary supply leads to a rise in the inflation rate. So if you imagine a blackboard, number 1 says money supply goes up, number 2 is empty, and number 3 is prices go up. And you have to fill in number 2. They don't have some kind of transmission in their theory. I looked it up for many years. I always, when I talk to monetarists, I always ask them about this number 2 thing. So how do you go from money supply going up to prices going up? Because you would have to assume that people in companies who are producing stuff, when they price their stuff, at some point, they look at costs, and then at some point they look at the change in the money supply. But I haven't met a single company, a single entrepreneur who said that when we do our prices, we look up the statistics of the Bank of England and we see how M1 or M2 is moving. Nobody does it. And that means it cannot be right. I mean, it's obvious.
They imply that the money supply dictates spending in the economy. Because they always say too much money chasing too few goods. They're implying that all this new money is going to necessarily be spent, and create aggregate demand. But they never explain how you go from creating reserves, which is what they usually mean, to increasing demand.
Yeah, because they would be Keynesians if they would do that. That's why they don't do it.
Right. And I think maybe it's because that those ideas are kind of first emerged maybe coming out of the gold standard, and this belief that, this idea that there was illegitimate money when you printed money, and therefore you diluted the value of the currency against the gold, and that necessarily, caused inflation because you're diluting that relationship.
By the way, this was why Georg Friedrich Knapp wrote his book, The State Theory of Money, because in the 1870s, there was this German war, so Austria against Prussia, and the Austrians lost, and they lost all their gold, but they continued to use their paper currency. And the German economists all said, well, you will fail with your currency, you will have runaway inflation because you have no gold, so there's nothing that backs it up. But the currency still worked. So the Austrian currency was still moving the economy, and there was no hyperinflation or nothing. So Georg Friedrich Knapp wrote this book, The State Theory of Money, to explain the fact that money apparently seems to work also when there is no gold in the economy. And he explicitly said that he was not in favor of that, but that it would be only a description of a system that works, and whether you like it or not, as an economist, you have to theorize why reality is, or why empirical reality is the way it is.
And that's ironic that is the exact opposite of Austrian economics.
Yeah.
The reason that, or the sort of ostensible reason that Elon's so bothered about inflation is because, it's this regressive tax, and I just care about the impact of regressive taxes.
Thank
on the
you.
regular people. It's the most. This is like vintage Musk. This is back in 2021. Inflation is the most regressive tax of all, yet is advocated by those who claim to be progressive.
Yes, it's so regressive. We need to make more people unemployed to lower inflation right now, Christian. That's a responsible thing to do, obviously.
if there is a middle class left in the United States, I'm sure that they borrowed a lot of money to buy a house. And that means, of course, that when you have inflation, normally the wages also go up. So that is, of course, a very good thing for the middle class, because the real estate loan will be inflated away, given that wages adjust to inflation, maybe if there's a short lag. So the real value of your debt goes down by quite a lot. And I'm pretty sure that in the 1970s, in Germany, as well as in the UK, but also in the US, where inflation rates were much higher, that many middle class people understood after the 1970s that inflation was good for them because it helped them to repay their mortgages.
Yeah, I think that was on David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. I think he talks about how economics for a long time, it was all about the interests of the debtors versus creditors, right? And that inflation is benefits debtors over creditors. And I can't remember the exact author, but I think it was Graeber who was.
It could also be Michael Hudson.
Oh, it could have been, yeah.
They both say the same thing, of course. So, and they're both right.
So we come around to 2024, and this kind of it may be seeing the seed of an idea for Doge now. This is Musk in 2024, reducing the federal deficit from 2 trillion to 1 trillion in financial year 2026 requires cutting an average of $4 billion a day in projected 2026 spending from now to September the 30th. This would result in a approximately $1 trillion deficit, but economic growth should be able to match that number, which would mean no inflation in 2026. So that's how that's his back of the envelope maths there.
That's really not a lot. I mean, they don't or he doesn't understand that it's a monetary circuit, and that of course what you put in terms of monetary injections from the government also returns to the government in the form of tax revenues. So if you cut government spending drastically, then tax revenues will shrink because, well, the private sector will have less income. So how can they pay more taxes? We've seen it all in Greece and in the other European countries where they imposed austerity in the early 2010s. In Greece, they cut government spending by 20%. They cut public sector wages by 20%. And then after 2 or 3 years, they had an unemployment rate of more than 25%, 50% for the youth. So youth unemployment rate of 50%. And that's what they got. So, I mean, whatever you think theoretically, I mean, these kind of examples should show you definitely that it's not a good idea to cut government spending if there is no real reason for it. So, I mean, theoretically speaking, there could be a reason to cut government spending because some of the government spending is wasteful, for example, and the private sector might use these resources better. So that is, of course, possible, and it would be a good reason to cut government spending. But in normal times like ours, where the government normally does not invest enough, where we have lots of problems in the sectors of education, transport, also healthcare and pensions, in this kind of world that we're living in, it's the opposite. So the government is too small; it has to spend more and not less. But I think these people are completely driven by their ideology, and they are far away from a scientific approach. So arguing with them in terms of scientific theories and trying to explain empirical reality with the use of theory, it's not going to work, because for them there is no theory, there's no science, there's only ideology. And they have their ideology very clear, and that's what defines them also personally, but also as groups. So the only thing that we can hope for is that democracy works, and that these people will be kicked out of the government by the electorate in the next elections.
I do find it fascinating. Nobody's ever seen Musk's credentials when it comes to economics, other than just he's running off businesses, I guess. And everybody is happy to just assume that because of his reputation of being a smart man, then he must know best about these things, and that this kind of napkin equation, calculation that he's done must be right. And I'm pretty happy to kind of entrust them with the running of those kind of government affairs so willingly. And I think a lot of it is driven by, we see things are not working, and obviously things are in crisis, but there's a group of people perhaps who are kind of isolated for a variety of reasons, who really want to believe that the problem is not that the system is working as intended, but rather that, there's other people that have messed with it, that interfere with it. And the obvious candidate is government has interfered from it from the outside, and that their ideal of the American dream in this case can still live somewhere, if only we deal with that external kind of force that is just ruining it for all of us. They hold on to that so much that they want to believe Elon Musk is right, and they want to believe that, if they just do this, all will be good and growth will, all they need to do is just cut all the federal spending and growth will happen, and nobody will be taxed ever again, and we will have, all the incomes will be fixed. Is that how you understand it? Because I find it absolutely fascinating.
I mean, from my view, it's not much to work with, but of course, if it appeals to the voters and they believe that it is roughly credible, and then other people also believe it's roughly credible, and there's all these people repeating these kind of viewpoints on Twitter, on YouTube and TikTok and wherever, then of course it is just the way it is, and that these kind of points become credible. And of course, the thing is just like whether you believe in gravity or not, if you drop an apple, it will fall down and not up. It's the same with the economy. I mean, if you cut government spending, you cut income for the non-government sector. That's an economic law in that sense. There's nothing you can do about it. Of course, you can postulate that a cut in government spending will increase private spending somewhere else because the private sector is jumping in there. But the private sector nevertheless has less income than before, and it's very unlikely that this will happen. So some people believe in fairy tales, and they can't see that they're wrong. And since they have they don't have these scientific foundations, these empirical foundations, that they have no knowledge of economic history, for example. So they don't know that what they are trying now has already been tried in Greece, for example. So it's a bit odd. I mean, Musk is one of these people who also pointed out that the US might end up with hyperinflation, or it might end up with a depression like Greece. So like many pundits in the US compared the United States to Greece, which is not a good idea because the Greeks were part of the Eurozone and they had problems with the central bank backing up the Greek government. It didn't do it in 2010, so the Greek government ran out of money. Now they didn't run out of money because the ECB has changed the way it works. So yeah, I mean, we already tried this cutting government spending in Europe, and the results were catastrophic. And there's no discussion why that should be different in the US, because apparently it seems like Musk and his people are not aware of the fact.
There's one thing that is different in the US, and that is that the central government has the capacity to make fiscal decisions. So it means that, for example, before the election, there were people saying that Trump was anti-war, that he was anti-imperialism, and of course he wasn't. But one of the points I was saying at the time, my argument was, look, usually politicians don't show themselves entirely. They're not going to show you the bits that they think are going to be unpopular. They may start showing themselves once they win the election. But one of the things that did give it away for me was that in his first term, his first kind of proposal of budget cuts of this cut all the budgets for most departments, with the exception of the military. When the military increased its budget, and you go, so why would you oil a machine that you're not planning to use? It doesn't make any sense to me. So it's no surprise that now he seems to be quite pro-war, and that actually, he seems now increasingly that he wants to invade a variety of countries. I don't think they are unaware of the fact that these cuts could cause a recession, and that they need to counter this with some aggressive spending elsewhere, but somewhere that does not empower people, but empowers their people. And that means going to war. So I think military spending is going to go up, and they're going to attempt to maintain the economy through this. And that means that they're going to have to find wars.
Yeah, I mean, Trump, like a businessman, I mean, he's looking for demand. And I think in his world, it's not him paying the military, but it's NATO countries in Europe mostly buying American fighter planes and whatnot. So that the economic growth comes through an increase in exports, creating industrial sector jobs. So to some extent, that connects to his "Make America Great Again" agenda. So it's not irrational policy. The same with the tariffs. So this is very traditional economic policy. Once you understand that economically speaking, you are the laggard, and the US is a laggard. I mean, it's a bit odd, but they lost 1 out of 3 jobs in the manufacturing sector in the 2000s. So they had something like 18 million manufacturing sector workers in 2000. And then 2010, just after the global financial crisis, they were down to, I don't know, it was 11 and a half or something like that, or maybe 12 million workers. But that has not really recovered. Under Biden, it has recovered a little bit. But I mean, Biden, I think it was less than 500,000 manufacturing jobs that were added after losing kind of around 5 million. So that made up for 10% of that number. So in that sense, if they sell more oil and gas at higher prices, if they sell more military goods and services, and if they export more infrastructure as well by basically blackmailing countries like, okay, if you don't want to have this tariff, order some stuff from the United States. And the obvious thing that governments will then order is public infrastructure from Halliburton and other companies. I mean, it makes sense as a strategy to try to increase the size of the manufacturing sector. Of course, there's risks to that as well. But I think it is... There is a plan in the background there. It's not that Trump somehow is erratically pushing buttons and not knowing what he's doing there. So he's acting like a businessman, and we should take him seriously. I mean, he's very hard to negotiate, but I think he can be dealt with.
But they're just saying things. Very often they say things like the tariffs 25%, and the next day, oh no, actually it's just 10%. They'll just say whatever it's going to actually cause outrage or harness support from their stronger supporters, just things that is going to keep the journalists busy. And then they have a real plan behind it. And you have to kind of unpack the nonsense from what is actually meaningful in what he's saying to try and figure out what that plan is.
So just putting to one side the idea that Trump threatens tariffs in order to get foreign countries to buy American stuff, and then they don't impose the tariffs. Let's just put that to one side and say that he means it. What does he think, or what does an advocate of tariffs on this 25% tariff on steel, what does he think is going to happen there?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess what he wants to see happening is that the US companies buy their steel from the United States companies that are producing that steel, and then you get those jobs back in the steel production sector instead of importing the cheaper steel from China. Of course, prices will be going up, and that means also that car prices, for example, might go up. The question is, of course, politically speaking, what is the trade-off there? I mean, it will probably increase employment in the steel sector. So these people will then vote for Trump because they were unemployed before, now they're employed. But cars will be more expensive, and that means that the price level goes up. If he does it to many sectors, then of course the inflation rate might also go up a little bit. I mean, I think the numbers we're in today, and the United States inflation came in at 3%, which is higher than expected. So of course, when you increase the price level, then you turn voters away. But probably inflation rate of 3% instead of 2%, it's not much. And also the wages might grow faster. And if the unions are able to push through higher wage increases. Yeah, so I don't know what will happen. I mean, it's a strategy that has been tried by many developing countries, but the US is the opposite. And it's also one of the biggest markets, or the biggest market in the world, that many world exporters are turning and relying to the US. Many German companies, for example, for them, the United States is the biggest market. So it would be more disastrous for German firms probably than for American firms if those tariffs were imposed, especially since the United States, I mean, their export to GDP ratio is probably around a little bit more than 10%. Same for imports. It's not much. For Germany, it's around 40%. So that means the whole issue of trade for the United States is not as important as it is for Germany or other countries which have definitely a higher trade to GDP ratio.
It's definitely going to hurt those countries more that kind of adhere to the mainstream economics agenda, like I guess the Eurozone countries. Than say, I can't imagine China not just figuring out what to do now that the West isn't buying as many of they're producing, I think they are in much better position to respond to that than the Eurozone, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Also, I mean, we should not forget that that exports, of course, are a cost to the economy. You're producing stuff that you do not consume then. So, I mean, the Chinese always used the exporting sector only to increase productivity. So it's all about increasing returns to scale. So the more you produce, the bigger your factory is, the more cost efficient you are. But of course, at some point, your factory is already very big, and maybe doubling the size does not increase productivity anymore.
Yeah, I feel they're not as dependent on exports now as they used to be.
Yeah, they can just grow their domestic demand by having higher wage growth. And then this production of electric vehicles that they cannot sell abroad will be absorbed by the domestic market, which it's nice for the Chinese people because they get to drive more electric vehicles, also at relatively cheaper prices because they don't compete with foreigners anymore buying those vehicles. So I do think that, yeah, China will not have problems adjusting to Trump's tariffs. On the other hand, the Chinese vehicles probably have the best technology when it comes to EVs. And probably the US should ask those companies to produce in the United States, because otherwise, if you cannot get the Chinese cars imported because it's too expensive and then they don't produce them in the US, then of course you have an offer of cars that is technologically backward. And that is something like the risk of the whole strategy, that you lose access to the best products of the world in those sectors where you impose tariffs.
But then this kind of throws a spanner in the works in terms of Trump's plan that you mentioned, that, he wants to force other countries to buy from the US. But then if China is already come to a point where it's developed its manufacturing industry, and China has all the tools to continue to do so quite cheaply, then why wouldn't countries simply just buy from China and China benefit from that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's their decision. But I think that at least in Europe, many companies in Germany, but also in France, they export a lot to China, but way more to the US. So some companies that we have in Germany, they probably sell 50% of their production in the United States. So they cannot switch from the US to China because the market is completely different. So in the US, you have lots of rich people, lots of middle class. And in China, China has also now a higher wage and they have higher incomes, but it's comparable to Central and Eastern Europe. It's not comparable to the US, not yet. So let's talk about, for example, premium cars. So BMW could not just say, well, let's wind down our operations in the US and sell BMWs to rich people in China. It's not going to work because there's not enough of them. And also the cars in China, the electric vehicles are better than the German ones, I would think. So the increased price of the German electric vehicle is not justified. Whereas in the United States, probably the tariffs on Chinese vehicles are higher, so they're not around. And then, of course, the BMW is a more attractive option. So yeah, all these things, this kind of diverging trade from one country to another, that's not something that can be done inside a year or two. It can be done in times of war, but not in peacetime if these are just private corporations.
And I have the view that it's not necessarily sufficient just to impose a tax. You also need to look at what state these industries are in an industry by industry basis, whether they can actually increase production, whether there are any other issues preventing them from doing so, etc.
Yeah, you would go back to this traditional idea of an industrial policy, that you're trying to combine the strengths of the public sector with the strengths of the private sector. But instead, in most Western countries, you still find these ideas of having private-public partnerships. Also, when it comes to AI, for example, that's what they're proposing now in the European Union. They want to create AI factories. I don't know why they call it factories, because these will be computer centers. But I also don't understand. It seems like the European Union will pay for these computer centers, and then companies can use them for free. That's a subsidy. But we have to go back to the 1950s and 60s and even before to understand what kind of smart policies can we use so that the private sector and the public sector work hand in hand. This idea that we just throw subsidies at the private sector, it would just create more inequality and more bad jobs, low-paid jobs. So it will not change the structure of the economic system. And that's what we need to see, this change in the structure of the economic system in order to have better results for everybody.
Just on this topic of, exports represent a real cost to a nation and imports represent a real benefit. Trump's also said he's considering imposing tariffs on the EU because, quote, they take almost nothing from the US and we take everything from them. Right. I mean, and then, he also, I think in 2024, the US had a trade deficit of like $213 billion with the EU. And Trump described that as an atrocity. I mean, what do you say to that?
We get so much free ice cream from our trading partners. It's really unfair. We would like to give them free ice cream as well, and they don't want to have it.
Stop giving me stuff, Christian. It's just...
Yeah, but I just wonder, okay, so he puts on this tariff. I mean, there's a 10% tax on all products from China, for instance. Now, you would think then somebody somewhere in policy making in China would go, hey, don't they need the stuff we're sending them more than we need US dollars, right? Wouldn't they work that out?
They would. And also at some point they will think, okay, so if they put tariffs on us, how about 100% tariff on Teslas? Also, I mean, the gigafactory that they have in Shanghai, I mean, they could increase the cost of that too. Because Elon Musk is a business owner, it would be relatively easy for a government to hit him with policy. For example, here in Europe, the sales of Tesla vehicles are breaking down because of what he's doing. I mean, he's talking to right-wing extremists in Germany and Spain and in other countries. He's interfering in elections in that way. Of course, he's a billionaire and he can do it. It's not that this is somehow forbidden. But of course, most of the people in Europe are not voting for right-wing extremist parties, and they will not buy a Tesla if they don't have to. And by now, there's a lot of different brands that are producing electric vehicles. So I think that Elon Musk is facing a problem in the midterm, in a way. That the sales of his car company will go down because Democrats in the US won't buy his vehicles, and social democrats and people from the left and progressives in Europe will also stop doing that, because why would they want to buy his cars if they completely disagree with his ideas, his political ideas?
Over here in the UK, the Overton window is moving right. I'd argue it's been given quite a big shove by the current Labour government for reasons that we've been talking about throughout this episode. And I know that you've got your own problems there in Germany with AfD. Dirk, what advice would you give to progressive opposition parties and movements right now? I mean, be as general or as specific as you like.
I mean, the whole situation that we have now, it has been years in the coming. I've been hanging around with these progressive economists and economists of the left and liberal economists and those who are conservative. And everybody kind of thought that, well, this right-wing stuff, it will go away. This inequality thing has nothing to do with that. But I'm pretty convinced, and I have been pretty convinced already like 10 years ago, that the rise in inequality is somehow the background of all of this. So it's not that you can disconnect it. I think there's many people who are very disappointed because the economic situation is bad and because the rich are getting richer. And it does not seem that the rich are somehow smarter or more efficient even. Even Elon Musk has collected billions of dollars in subsidies from the government, and now he's cutting billions of spending from that government that fed him and that made him. That's really ironic. So what is it that political parties of the left, what they should do? They should look at the deficits that we have in our societies and suggest how to solve it. Money is not the problem. So talk about resources, talk about energy, talk about sustainable use of resources. So something like a Green New Deal would be, I think, a perfect thing to suggest to the voters and say, look, seriously, the world is heating up. The planet is getting hotter every single year. So how do we fix this? And then talk about these problems, not talking about how we pay for it, but instead how we source it. And I think that would be the only way to beat those right-wing extremists. Everything else, I think, is not going to work.
P, do you have thoughts on that? What should the left's answer to far-right politics be?
I think we've been running out of time since 2008, slowly running out of time. And now it feels quite imminent that we're going to have these already in the US, but in the UK, that we're going to have this far right party. And then in the EU as well, you see it in Germany and in other countries. And I think it's go big or go home by now. I think if you're in the left, there's no point playing this kind of I'm gonna do piecemeal kind of messages here about how we can improve our world with small changes. No,
one market solution at a time.
Yeah, with another market solution, right? No, we need a grand narrative of what is wrong, what is fundamentally wrong with what's happening, and how we're going to fix it, and to draw examples from our past in order to say, we have done it before. Look, we can do it. This has been done before. We did it during the war. We even did it during the pandemic. We used the capacities of the government to mobilize resources pretty fast during the pandemic, despite the fact that we didn't have a great government back then. Of course, we did it during the war, and that won us the war. And we need to do it now again. We need to draw on these examples from the past to show people that we can do it. But we also need to not be shy about critiquing the whole system, and or sounding too much like an outsider, or like we are not respecting the kind of the credible bounds of economic discourse right now. No, we've run out of time for that kind of game. We need to be straight with people. We need to tell people how it is, and of course we need to influence whoever can influence as many politicians as possible, right? Whether that's writing to an MP or getting into a campaigning group, just everything we can throw at it right now. And I understand we're not in a great position, but we don't really have a choice.
That's where we're going to have to leave it. We're going to be revisiting this quite a bit in the coming weeks and months. We've been speaking to Dr. Dirk Ehnts. I'll link to where you can stay current with Dirk in the show notes for this episode. This year, Dirk will be teaching at the Lipinski Foundation's highly recommended MMT Summer School in Poznan, Poland on July the 29th to the 31st. And he'll also be at the International European MMT Conference, which takes place in Berlin on the 2nd and 3rd of August. Before that, Dirk will be appearing at the Scotonomics Festival in Dundee on Friday the 21st of March, and that can be attended in person or online. If you want to take your understanding of MMT and real-world economics to the next level, Modern Money Lab is running online graduate and postgraduate courses. I've been a student there, and it's fantastic. I can't recommend it enough. It's been devised by the cream of MMT lecturers, including Dirk. So I'll link to more about that and where you can find out more about Modern Money Lab UK in the show notes. I'll also link to where you can sign up for Patricia's MMT Activist Network. And as ever, for our Patreon subscribers, there'll be a link to all of our patron-only episodes. Lots of extras there for you to unlock. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Dr. Dirk Ehnts.
Yeah, thanks. It was great talking to you guys.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.
In what scenario would he consider that money supply is increasing faster than the production of goods?
Let me just get him on the phone.